Greetings, my name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition, we're honored to be joined by Professor Eric Foner. He is the DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University. He's author of numerous books, and he's one of the most respected historians in the country, and also the recipient of the Pulitzer as well as the Bancroft Prize for American History. We're going to discuss his new book as well as his perceptions of things as relates to a U.S. history today. Are you ready? Well, I am. Let's go.
Professor Eric Foner, DeWitt Clinton Professor of History at Columbia University. My first question is this. Your uncle, Philip, and your father, Jack, and you, all three of you have done a lot of research in African American history. How does that come about?
How did that come about? Well, you know, my father and uncle, as you say, were historians. They were also identical twins, by the way. They came of age in the 1930s. They were, you know, part of the so-called Old Left back then. That was a group of white people who were probably the most interested in the condition of African Americans at that time.
Include Herbert Aptheker, too.
Herbert Aptheker, another one. I mean, these were the people who started. I'm not talking about it in the black colleges where there were plenty of people doing this, but outside of that, among white scholars, they were the ones who really started investigating African American history. Aptheker, as you say, American Negro slave revolts. My uncle Philip with his work on Frederick Douglass, and then
labor,
many
labor too.
And well, on labor, on black labor, and my father wrote a book later on about blacks in the military, the history. So, you know, I grew up in the suburbs, pretty much an all-white suburb in Long Island, but this was in our house, in our, you know, in our dinner time conversations, the idea that race was really important in America. This was the #1 problem facing the country. This is the 1950s, before the height of the civil rights movement, when it wasn't really being emphasized very much in the media, etc. My family knew W.E.B. Du Bois, they knew Paul Robeson. So this was just something second nature to me, that this was really very important. And then in the 1960s, when I'm in college and graduate school, at the height of the civil rights revolution, you know, as you know, it's the present that gives historians the questions they're interested in. And I and many other people of my generation started looking into the historical origins of why this crisis was happening in the country at that time. You know, the history of slavery, the history of the anti-slavery movement, the history of black movements of one kind or another. And so, you know, it just flowed from the time that I was learning about history at the college and graduate level. So I've been, you know, writing about it ever since.
Now, is it true that your family, including Herbert Aptheker, were hounded because of?
Oh yeah, Aptheker, my father, my uncle, all were sort of blacklisted for a long, long time. Could not teach in the mainstream universities because they were accused of being communists. You know, this was even before McCarthyism, but then heightened at that time. Eventually, my uncle, Phil, got a job at Lincoln, an African-American university in Pennsylvania. My father eventually got a job up at Colby College in Maine, but for quite a few years, they could not teach. They kept writing, but they were kept out of the universities. And that, the keeping of communists out of the universities also kept African-American history out of the mainstream universities in a certain sense.
Sure. I read somewhere when you started undergraduate school, you were not really interested in history? Is that
No,
correct?
I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be an astronomer. You know, I loved that, physics, astronomy. The first 2 years in college, I took math and science and everything, but I kind of ran up against the limits of my own ability eventually. And also, I'd always been interested in history just because it was in my household. And you know, and then you know, as a teacher, and I know that a teacher can be very inspiring. I took a course with Professor James Shenton, you remember him, who taught at Columbia here, on the Civil War era. And it just, you know, an inspiring teacher can just make you think it's really important. And that's what got me into this era, and I've been stuck there ever since.
I have a James Shenton story I'll tell you later.
All right, good. Well, he was a great man, a great teacher.
Well, your recent book, Gateway to Freedom, The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. Before we get into the book, just tell the audience, what are some of the mythologies about the Underground Railroad?
Well, everybody's heard of the Underground Railroad. I mean, the term is widely known, obviously. but the amount of knowledge about it is limited, and there are a lot of myths. You know, there's the myth that it was this highly organized system with regular routes, almost like a real railroad. You know, they take the metaphor too far. Set routes, stations, agents, you know, secret passwords. It wasn't nearly as organized as that, you know. There's a myth which early literature on the Underground Railroad propagated, that basically this was white abolitionists assisting helpless blacks. You know, people ran away, which of course means they weren't helpless, but they were in need of assistance, and the white abolitionists were the focus of the story, not the actual fugitive slaves, who were the people with the great courage and resourcefulness. There's another opposite myth, which some people, that there really was no Underground Railroad at all, that it was all invented later by abolitionists. That's not true either. You know, there's talk about secret passwords and secret...
About like lanterns in the windows?
Yeah, lanterns. It wasn't like that. It really wasn't.
Quilts with codes?
Quilts with secret paths on them. No, in all my research, I never found a mention of a quilt in that era. Later on, people started talking about that. The Underground Railroad was a set of local networks in local communities, both cities and rural areas, which communicated with each other. They rose and fell, these local groups. The Philadelphia Committee went out of existence for several years, then it came back. So, you know, it was unstable, but the number of people involved was quite small. I was astonished. I mean, you know, in New York City, a city of 500,000 people in 1850, there were probably no more than a dozen people working kind of more or less full-time to help fugitive slaves. There were others who did something now and then, but we shouldn't think of it as a giant operation. What's astonishing is how much those few people in Philadelphia or New York or other cities were able to accomplish, actually, in helping a good number. Now, again, what is the number of slaves who escaped to Canada? Nobody knows. There are exaggerated numbers out there. I mean, my guess, and it is just a guess, is that in the 30 years before the Civil War, about 1,000 slaves a year managed to get out and get up to the north and often Canada. 1,000 a year, 30,000. That's a lot of people. There were 4 million slaves, so it's not destroying the institution of slavery. Nonetheless, it was significant enough that it became a major point of dispute between North and South, and it contributed, the action of fugitive slaves in the Underground Railroad contributed in significant ways to the coming of the Civil War. It was part of the growing divide between North and South.
Well, let's look at New York City. Now, in 1835, you had this New York Vigilance Committee.
Yeah.
And I looked at their records some years ago, and I saw in 1837 they claimed they had saved 335 people from being kidnapped.
Yeah, well, yes, I would say the formation of the New York Vigilance Committee in 1835 was the beginning of the Underground Railroad. Obviously, there had been fugitive slaves before that, and there were individuals who helped them, but this was the first organized group dedicated to helping fugitive slaves. Of course, as you know, it was founded by David Ruggles, a black abolitionist here in New York, and most of the members were black, local African Americans here in the city, with some white abolitionists also helping them. And the money often came from white abolitionists like Louis Tappan, who was a pretty wealthy, you know, New York merchant. They were started, as you sort of say, actually to stop a different mode of movement, is blacks being kidnapped in the North and sent to the South into slavery. There were kidnappers on the streets of New York City.
Long before Solomon Northup, too.
Before Solomon Northup. Today, people know about that because of the movie from last year. But particularly children. There were gangs that would just grab a black child off the street and throw him on a boat, and he's being sold to slavery. And this obviously was a terribly, you know, upsetting thing, as well as being totally illegal. And the Vigilance Committee started to stop kidnapping, and then very quickly it turned around and said, well, we're also going to be helping slaves who were moving from south to north. Yeah, they said they helped 300 slaves. Later on, they said they helped, you know, those are the numbers we have. Is it true? I don't know if they helped 300 slaves. I mean, I take their numbers pretty much at face value. Maybe there was some exaggeration, you know, because these publications were to raise money, and so the more they claimed they did, the more people were perhaps willing to
Sure.
contribute. But I think that's a pretty reasonable statistic.
Reading your book, I was amazed by two people. One was Louis Napoleon. The other one was Sidney Howard Gay, who had this record of
Right.
fugitives, which is somewhat rare to
Quite
document who came through, their names,
Quite unusual.
where they came from, where they were
Well,
going
let's
to go.
start with Louis Napoleon, who I had never heard of before I started work on this book. And I've studied this period a lot, as you know. Louis Napoleon was a black man living in New York City, illiterate. We know that because there are documents in our archives here where he signs things with an X. But he was sort of the main, I don't know what you call it, operative of the Underground Railroad in New York City. I mean, he's out there on the streets. He's looking for fugitives at the docks who are hidden on ships. He's meeting fugitives sent by train from Philadelphia. He's meeting them at the depot. He's the guy who's actually more active in this over a long period of time, the 1830s, 40s, 50s, than anybody. My book ends, as you know, the last sentence of my book is his death certificate in 1881. This is 30 years after the Civil War, where he says, now he doesn't say, the person who filled out the death certificate says his occupation was Underground Railroad agent. That's 30 years later. Sidney Howard Gay is really the reason I wrote this book in the first place, in the sense that, as you said, I stumbled upon, actually thanks to a student who pointed it out to me, this record of fugitives that he kept. It's in our Columbia University Rare Books library, but no one knew about it because it wasn't cataloged, it wasn't indexed. A student pointed it out to me one day. She said, you know, you might find this interesting, Professor. I saw this document up there. For 2 years, 1855 and 56, Gay kept a record of over 200 men, women, and children who came through New York City, fugitive slaves. They passed through his office. He was an anti-slavery editor, and his office was kind of a key depot of the Underground Railroad. He recorded who they were, who owned them. He interviewed them. He's a journalist. You got their stories in there. Why did they run away? How did they run away? How did they get away? Who helped them? And then where he sent them. He sent them to Syracuse. He sent them to Albany, to Canada. He even recorded how much money he spent, $2.50 for a railroad ticket, that kind of thing. But it's an amazing document because it is contemporary. It's right at the time. You get the voices of these fugitive slaves. It's not like reminiscences 30, 40 years later, which may be a little, inaccurate. So I had never seen a document like this. It turns out that actually in Philadelphia, William Still, who was a black abolitionist who ran the anti-slavery office there, also kept a record like this. He wasn't the journalist like Gay. They're not as rich stories, but if you compare those two documents, you get a whole picture of how people came up through Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, onto New York City. Still sent, more than half the people in Gay's record came from Philadelphia through William Still. So you've got, and you can compare the stories, and they pan out. In other words, a good way of judging the accuracy of what people are telling Gay. So it's a remarkable document. I will say we have just digitalized it and put it online. If you want to Google Gay record of fugitives, up it'll pop, along with a transcript that I put together so you can actually read, and they're fascinating stories. They are absolutely moving and dramatic, and people escaping, people being chased, people almost being captured, stories of slavery, stories of freedom. It's a really rich document of this period of the mid-1850s.
Yeah. I think one thing that will surprise our audience is you read about Underground Railroad, maybe you've seen it on television or movies, and someone's running through the swamps and being chased by bloodhounds. Then I'm reading your book and it's saying, so-and-so arrived at Port Amboy on the boat.
Yeah.
Or so-and-so is coming by train from Baltimore.
There were people who ran away through the woods, spent days, weeks getting up to the north, but that was difficult, to say the least. They used the modern technology. They used, Frederick Douglass, as you know, escaped on a train in 1838. The year after the railroad was put into effect there, Douglass got on it and just came to New York. One day, and there he was. Many boats, the East Coast, there were thousands of boats going up and down the East Coast, and there were captains who were willing to hide fugitive slaves on their boat for money. These guys weren't committed abolitionists. They were making a buck by taking money from slaves who had accumulated a little bit, hiding them on the boat and leaving them off in Philadelphia or in New York. So yes, there were innumerable ways that slaves escaped. Boat, train. There was a group that stole their owner's horse-drawn carriage in Maryland, and the 3 or 4 slaves, and they just rode up into Pennsylvania. That's another, we don't think of the Underground Railroad like that. And there were people who hid out in the woods and went on foot. But the number of I was surprised also when I started compiling this information, how many came by boat and train and not in the kind of
traditional way,
famous traditional way of running through the woods at night, or in the day and sleeping out at night, etc.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when you think about the Underground Railroad, and as I read your book, I was thinking of how could somebody freely travel in Pennsylvania or New York, a runaway slave. And I'm thinking of today, because then you had free African American men and women. And today you have a lot of people in the United States illegally.
Yes.
And
very similar.
They're Latinos, but then Mexicans, Guatemalans, and I guess people say, oh, I guess they're Puerto Ricans.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point. In the South, as you know, a black person had to carry a pass. A free black person had to carry papers to prove he was free. A slave who was off the plantation for one, and they were given permission to go, but they needed a pass from the owner. So in the South, it was very, very tricky because any white person could apprehend a black person and just demand to see their pass, their papers. Once they got up to Pennsylvania, New York, you didn't need a pass to be. They were free black people, as you say, and there was no law against a black person being on a train or anything like that. So they didn't have to produce evidence. Now, it is true that there were slave catchers also looking for them. And if you looked like a slave catcher could grab you. In fact, one of the things I mentioned in southern Pennsylvania, where there were a lot of Quakers involved in this group of women who had a kind of sewing circle where they just made clothes for fugitive slaves who passed through, so they wouldn't look like slaves anymore. They would not be wearing their slave outfit. They'd be in better clothing, and therefore they wouldn't look as if they just escaped from slavery. But yes, the idea of people traveling around who are not legally entitled to be there is an interesting analogy to what's going on in this country today.
And would you make a comparison? Would you say easier or more difficult for a runaway slave at that time period to get to freedom, whether it's Canada or further north, or say a Jewish person during World War II to get out of Nazi Germany?
The South was a pretty totalitarian place, but it wasn't quite like Nazi Germany, I don't think.
But you hear stories about Jewish people being hidden in
being
Holland
hidden.
And other places.
It is similar to that. And as you say, today there are churches that help illegal immigrants, just like there were back then. And there are people who want to deport them back to where they came from, just as there were at the time. There were a lot of people in New York City who were perfectly happy to help capture a fugitive slave and send them back, because as you well know, New York's economy was tied into the South. New York merchants controlled the cotton trade. There were Southerners on the streets of New York all the time. And there were many people in New York whose economic fortunes were tied into the South. So there were people who were perfectly happy to help capture fugitive slaves and send them back, and judges and officials who were happy to do that. New York was not a safe place for fugitives. That's why Gay had to get them out. They arrived one day, the next day he's sending them out, because upstate New York was more anti-slavery. But after 1850, you really had to get to Canada if you wanted to be free, because the Fugitive Slave Law greatly strengthened the apparatus for capturing fugitive slaves.
Especially when a magistrate could get $10 for finding a runaway guilty and $5 for finding them
$10 if he sent them back to the South, $5 if he freed them. They said this was put the price of the conscience of a judge at $5, right?
Tell me this, in my casual readings of African American newspapers, sometimes I come across an article and say, "Colored people beware. There's a man of color who's helping the slave catchers."
There were, listen, this is not everybody is a hero in any group of people, right? There were some there was a group of kidnappers that operated in Pennsylvania in the 1820s, coming across from Maryland and kidnapping blacks off the streets of Philadelphia, and it was interracial. blacks and whites working together to kidnap people and sending them into slavery. So, yeah, there were blacks who betrayed. One of the cases that I talk about of Stephen Pembroke and his two sons, a black man and his sons who escaped in the early 1850s from Maryland, got to New York, and then were captured the next day, and it was generally thought that some black person had betrayed them. Some guy in the abolitionist movement had actually told the police where they were and what house they were hiding in.
Yeah, I recall reading a letter, a correspondence between Seraile and her runaway slave, Jermaine Logan.
Jermaine Logan, who was the king, they called him, of the Underground Railroad in Syracuse.
But she had said she needed $1,000 from him because she was getting bankrupt, and he stole the heart. So give me $1,000. And she said, "Oh, by the way, your mother's doing fine."
Yeah.
And he writes back, "You wicked woman!
If
I come back, I'll come back to free my relatives."
Yeah, she offered him his freedom for $1,000. Right. His mother was still a slave, and in the letter she said, "You know, I always treated you like a child, like a member of the family. I don't know why you escaped." And in his letter back, he said, "Woman, did you raise your own children to be sold at the auction block? What do you mean you treated me like a member of your family?" Logan was a pretty militant guy.
Yeah. So I read about him. He ended up being a minister in AME Church.
Yeah, he did. Right.
We're just about out of time. It always seems to go by too quickly when you're having fun with conversations with two historians. You have any final words you'd like to add about your book, besides buy it?
I hope people find it interesting. To me, what's interesting about it is these stories of individual people that come to life out of the records of Gay, of Still, the words of these fugitive slaves, the experience of these fugitive slaves. And also, I think it's actually inspiring, considering all the problems that have arisen in the last few months. Here you have a case of black and white people working together in a just cause to help these fugitives. The Underground Railroad was an integrated institution, and people can cooperate if they put their mind to it.
Well, we have another episode following this one, and we'll get into some more contemporary things.
Okay.
So on behalf of Cultural Caravan, Professor Foner, I want to thank you very much.
Great to talk to you.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. And please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan.
I realized that to learn about the people, you study the dance. And when you study the dance, you learn the history of the people, because dance in traditional African cultures used to preserve, and so that the young coming forth learn by age group. And as I said, you know, I'm skipping years. In traditional African cultures, you learn by age group. So you would have the toddlers who will be going around, they aren't paying any attention, but they are, because these rhythms are becoming a part. And then as they go into the initiation rites, everything is explained. Then after the initiation, then they are ready for courtship and marriage, and then maybe baby naming ceremonies, and on and up until time they make the transition to the grand ancestral grounds.